Thank you for joining today. My name is Paul Marston and I'm working with RESPEC. We were in charge of completing the TMDL studies for the lakes and rivers in Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed. In this presentation, I will be going over the TMDLs that were completed for the North Management Zone of the Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed. And thank you for joining us. Hopefully you're still able to gather useful information from these presentations, even though we're not able to do this in person. I'm going to start the presentation by providing a watershed overview for the Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed as a whole. Then we're going to focus in on the management zone of concern and the impaired lakes that are located there. I'm then going to provide a high-level overview of the BATHTUB model and how it was used to develop the total maximum daily loads for each of these lakes. And then we will look more closely at each of the lakes and review the draft allocation tables for the TMDL, the load reductions necessary to meet the water quality standards, and where those reductions may come from, as well as the RAPS restoration strategies. The Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed was separated into 3 separate management zones during the RAPS process, which helped guide the prioritization efforts for restoration and protection strategies. The 3 management zones that make up the Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed include the North, the Central, and the South management zones. These were separated based upon geographic area, common land use cover, and similar pollutant sources. Across the Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed, there is a total of 18 impaired lakes for nutrients. And in total, 11 of those have TMDL studies completed, which include Gun, Fleming, Elm, Ripple, Crowing, CB, FAWN, Lower Mission, Trace, Big Swan, and Moose. There were 7 impaired lakes for nutrients that did not have TMDL studies completed. To determine if a lake is impaired is based on the MPCA standard. And these standards vary across the state dependent upon the ecoregion that the lake is located in. In the Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed is located in 2 ecoregions, with the southern portion located in the north-central hardwood forests ecoregion. On the map, that's denoted by the thick gray line that kind of starts up in the north, comes down south near Long Prairie, and then heads east. And so lakes in the north-central hardwood forests are held to the water quality standards for that ecoregion, which is for deep lakes, 40 parts per billion, and for shallow lakes, 60 parts per billion. Much of the watershed is located in the northern lakes and forests ecoregion. And for this ecoregion, there's no separate standard for shallow lakes. It is just the 30 parts per billion for phosphorus for all lakes. As I mentioned, this presentation is focused on just the TMDL lakes in the North Management Zone. The map in this slide shows the location of those lakes, in addition to the lakes that are impaired but were not addressed or had TMDL studies completed. And because these are all located in the northern lakes and forest ecoregion, all of these lakes were held as a standard of 30 parts per billion for phosphorus. Before I review each individual TMDL lake in this management district, I want to provide a high-level overview of the BATHTUB model that is used to develop these load allocation tables and the final reductions necessary to meet the water quality standard. So the first step in developing a BATHTUB model is modeling the current conditions of the lake. And that is done by entering the various pollutants and pollutant sources that enter a lake. So that is tributaries and lakeshed runoff, which it comes from the calibrated HSPF model outputs. septic systems, which we have an approach to estimate the load coming from that, point sources if there are any, and atmospheric deposition. Once the loads are entered into the model, you calibrate the model to represent and match the observed water quality that was collected by either the MPCA or local government units. This is where you determine if there is internal loading occurring, and this is done by what we call a mass balance analysis, and also using professional judgment based upon lake characteristics, observed water quality, depth and temp DO profiles to determine if there's likely anoxic conditions at the base, if there's mixing, and together use that approach to determine if there likely is internal loading. And finally, you run calibration and add calibration factors to match the model so that it simulates the observed water quality data for TP, chlorophyll A, and Secchi depth. Once you have a calibrated existing conditions modeled, that is the current load allocation. From there, you can determine what reductions are necessary to meet the water quality standards. And so you reduce the inputting loads, incoming loads, largely tributaries and lakeshed runoff, until you reach that water quality standard. In addition, you add a 10% for a margin of safety to ensure that through these reductions you are able to achieve that water quality standard. The first lake we are going to take a look at in the North Management Zone is Gun Lake. Gun Lake is located in the far northeast corner of the watershed near Aiken. It does not have a very large drainage area, which includes the lakeshed and the one tributary that drains to it upstream of it. You can see in the map that the lakeshed area is denoted by the red outlined area, while the magenta shows the upstream drainage area for tributary 61, and that tributary 61 is tied to the HSPF model reach. As we look at each lake, we're going to look at the area that drains to it, the loading that also drains to it, focusing on where it originates from as far as the land cover type. Then we'll review the load allocation tables and where we can then achieve the reductions based on the loads from the land use and land cover types. So looking at the loading that's coming in from the tributary area upstream as well as the lakeshed, we can see that the total phosphorus load is largely driven by wetland, and although the wetland area makes up a majority of the drainage area, cropland and pasture and developed do contribute a significant amount of the total phosphorus to Gun Lake. We can see too that there is significant internal loading occurring in Gun Lake, which feeds the overall phosphorus load balance. And something to note as we look at the numbers in these slides compared to what is shown in the next slide in the load allocation table is the load total that comes from the drainage area is going to be slightly different in this slide because this is based on land loading totals, and so this is what is reaching the stream or water body from the land. And so in the case of this, for anything in that tributary 61 area that reaches the ditch, there's going to be some attenuation that occurs within that stream. And so ultimately, depending on those in-stream dynamics, which is modeled in HSPF, that exact amount of load that's coming off of the land, draining from the land, may not necessarily make it to the lake. But you will see that the loading is going to be relatively close. But this gives us an idea from the landscape perspective of where this phosphorus load is coming from. Here's the total maximum daily load allocation table for Gun Lake. So there is a lot going on in this table. We'll start across the top and walk through what each of these columns are. So the first columns show the different sources of phosphorus loads broken out into waste load and just general load. The waste load here is going to include either point sources as well as the construction and industrial stormwater. Now, this construction and industrial stormwater, a more detailed summary of this can be found in the TMDL report, but this is just simply an assumption. In some of these lakes, in these more remote areas, there's likely not any construction or industrial stormwater occurring at this moment, but it's based on county estimates, and that allocation is just subtracted from the overall lake shed load, and so that load is still present. It's just how we are allocating it in this table. And so those first two columns, or the second two columns, is the existing TP load. And so this is that calibrated bathtub model to the existing conditions. And this is pounds per year and pounds per day. The next two columns show the allowable TP load. And so this is the load that the lake can handle and still meet water quality standards with the addition of a 10% margin of safety. And the final two columns show the overall estimated load reduction that is needed for the lake to meet the water quality standards. So we can see here that loading is largely driven by the tributary 61 in addition to internal loading. And from the previous slide, that shows which land cover types are contributing that phosphorus load. To establish the allowable load, it is general practice for the SSTS, which is the septic systems. We assume that is going to be 0 in the future. Atmospheric deposition is nothing that we can control. That is just phosphorus loading that occurs through precipitation. And so here we can see that the load reductions that we are really targeting are going to be based on land practices, BMPs, applied for tributary 61 and in the lake shed. Here we are not calling for any internal loading reduction. And overall, Gun Lake is not very far past the water quality standard, and so total reduction in the annual or daily TP load that is needed to meet the water quality standards is 15%. Again, there's a lot going on in these tables, but the purpose of this is to look at the existing TP load based on the HSPF loads for each land cover type and determine what % reductions are needed on the typical land cover types that will be targeted using BMPs. And so starting at the top table, we're looking at the tributary 61 total phosphorus loads. And to achieve the reduction from the previous load allocation table, targeting developed land use, pasture, and cropland equally, we need to see a 64.6, about 65% reduction in TP coming from those land cover types. And moving to the second table in the Gun Lake Lakeshed, we need to roughly get 47% reduction in the TP load from the developed pasture and cropland land cover types to achieve the reduction needed from the allocation table. This table is a quick summary of the restoration strategies identified in the RAPS process by the project team that were identified to try to address the load reductions necessary to meet the water quality standard. And so, as you can see, there is nutrient management types, or BMPs, to try to reduce the total nutrient runoff from croplands, septic system improvement, addressing lakeshore erosion. And we did include in lake management, there's curly-leaf pondweed, and although the effects of curly-leaf pondweed on internal loading is highly variable and dependent on individual lake conditions, we included in lake management simply for, if nothing else, establishing native vegetation population here. And stormwater runoff control, most impervious areas are going to be seen here around the lake on landowner properties, and so it's going to be stormwater runoff control and individual property owners, and then public outreach to provide educational opportunities to lakeshore property owners and what they can do to help reduce their impacts on Gun Lake. The next lake we're going to focus on in the North Management Zone is Fleming Lake. It is just southeast of Gun Lake, and similar to Gun, has a not too terribly large drainage area made up of its immediate lakeshed and one tributary. Here, the land use is largely dominated by forest, followed by wetland. Looking at the loads that are coming from the landscape based on the HSPF model, we can see that it is a majority, or the largest single contributing source is wetlands, followed by forests, and this is due to such a large area of this catchment and upstream drainage area being wetland or forest. And then that's followed by cropland, pasture, and developed land covers. Looking at the allocation table for Fleming Lake, we can see that the lakeshed here is a good portion of the loading as well as internal loading. The overall load is lower than we saw in Gun Lake, but reductions needed to meet the water quality standard are a 58% reduction to the lakeshed loading, a 91% reduction to internal loading, for overall reduction for 64% to meet the water quality standard. Looking at the Fleming Lake lakeshed and the existing TP load by land use, and determining what reductions are needed to achieve the allocated or allocation tables reductions needed to meet the water quality standards, we can see that just targeting developed pasture and cropland land cover types is not going to achieve the reduction that is needed. And so additional practices will be needed in the Fleming lakeshed to achieve the total lakeshed reductions needed to meet the water quality standards. And this is in addition to reductions needed for the internal loading. The restoration strategies that were added by the project team as a part of the RAPS project are similar to Gun Lake and include BMPs to address phosphorus from cropland, septic system improvement, lakeshore stabilization to reduce the amount of sediment that is entering the lake, in-lake management to establish a healthy native vegetative population, pasture management, and stormwater runoff control, as well as public outreach. Next lake we're looking at is Elm Island. Elm Island is located south of the previous two lakes, just north of Lake Mille Lacs. Elm Island has a very large drainage area with a lot of lakes, and as you get closer to Elm Island in the drainage area, there's a number of ditch networks as well, old wetlands that were ditched. The tributary coming in is HSPF Reach 101. And we can see that a lot of the area, similar to the previous two lakes, is made up of wetland and forest land cover. Looking at the phosphorus loads that are reaching the lake based on the HSPF model shows that wetlands contribute the most total phosphorus, and that is followed by forests, and again, which makes sense given the overall land cover area for each of these, and then cropland and pasture and developed land cover types are also contributing a significant amount of total phosphorus. Looking at the allocation table for Elm Island shows that the tributary 101 and that large drainage area is contributing the most phosphorus, and that is followed by internal loading. And to meet the water quality standards, we need to achieve a 39% reduction for the tributary 101 total phosphorus load, a 39% reduction in the lakeshed TP load, as well as a 90% reduction in the internal loading, and the 100% reduction in septics for a total of a 56% reduction in the TP load for Elm Island Lake. Looking at what reductions are needed by land cover type from the existing TP loads in the HSPF model, we can see that for the Elm Island tributary 101 area, simply focusing on BMPs addressing TP loads and developed areas, grassland, land cover, sorry, not grassland, but pasture and cropland, shows again that achieving those reductions from that tributary will not be able to be done simply from addressing those land cover types. Though in the lakeshed, in the second table below, shows that while it would be very aggressive, these reductions are achievable by focusing BMPs on the developed grass, pasture, and cropland in the lakeshed area. The restoration strategies that were determined in the RAPS process include many of the similar strategies that we've seen already here, which include septic system improvements, shoreline stabilization, managing fertilizer rates, and nutrient timing for fertilizer to manage or to try to reduce the nutrient loads coming from cropland, in addition to stormwater runoff control for any impervious areas in that lakeshed area, and public outreach. And then for Elm Island, because there are a lot of ditched areas just upstream of it, another restoration strategy is trying to restore or abandon those ditches to reduce the amount of dissolved phosphorus that is coming from those areas. And after large rain events, those areas likely pulse large amounts of dissolved phosphorus, which is driving much of the phosphorus load from the tributary area, as well as establishing conservation easements to establish more perennial vegetation in suitable areas. The next lake, Ripple Lake, is just downstream of Elm Island. So the drainage area is very similar to Elm, is just slightly larger, includes that Elm Island Lakeshed area for its upstream tributary drainage area, and then the Lakeshed, the immediate drainage area to Ripple Lake. So similar to Elm Island, the drainage area is largely dominated by forest and wetland land cover types. The TP loads coming from each of these land cover types, based on the HSPF model, show that wetlands and forests contribute a lot of the TP, but again, that's due to just the overall size or percent of the area that is covered in those land cover types. You can see that the cropland, pasture, and developed land cover types do jump out as higher loading rate areas, which contribute a decent amount of total phosphorus to Ripple Lake. Looking at the allocation table, one thing to note here that's slightly different than the previous is for tributary 103, the reductions here are achieved by upstream Elm Island Lake. So this is establishing a boundary condition so that if Elm Island meets its water quality standards, that will turn into a 15% reduction for tributary 103. Other reductions necessary in the Lakeshed, with a total load of 438 pounds per year, there needs to be a 34% reduction to achieve water quality standards. In addition to internal loading, we are calling for a 48% reduction, 100% reduction in septic system, for an overall TP load reduction of 27% to meet the water quality standards. For the source load reductions in Ripple Lake, we can see for the tributary, this is much more achievable based on Elm Island Lake upstream of it meeting its water quality standards. And so this area here only needs to, through BMPs, achieve a roughly 43% TP load reduction on developed pasture and cropland cover types. And for the Lakeshed, the load reductions to achieve the allocation tables called for load reductions are also achievable with a 65–66% reduction in TP loads needed in the developed pasture and cropland areas. During the RAPS process, the strategies that were identified to achieve these reductions include septic system improvements, lakeshore shoreline stabilization, managing cropland fertilizer rates and timing to reduce nutrient loads from cropland, stormwater runoff control, public outreach, as well as establishing conservation easements and converting lands to perennials where applicable. Fawn Lake is located sort of on the west end of the northern management zone, right on the edge of the Mississippi River-Brainerd watershed. Has a much smaller drainage area than the previous two lakes, with Bass Lake being upstream of it, then feeding into its immediate lakeshed. Similar to many of the lakes in the northern lakes and forest ecoregion, Fawn Lake is in the drainage area is mostly made up of wetland and forests. As far as the total phosphorus loads coming from the various land cover types, though, we do see that cropland in the Fawn Lake drainage area is contributing a significant amount of total phosphorus, especially considering its overall area that it makes up of the drainage area, followed by developed and forest. Looking at the Fawn Lake TMDL load allocation table, the lake shed is contributing 344 pounds per year. The internal loading is contributing 441 for a total annual existing TP load of 832. To achieve the water quality standards, we need to see a reduction of 66% TP in the lake shed, 69% to internal loading, and 100% to septic systems for a total TP load reduction of 66% to achieve the water quality standards. To look at the land cover types and their load contributions, and to see if where to achieve that allocation table's load reductions for the lake shed, and see that it's going to require aggressive reductions on the developed pasture and cropland land cover types to achieve the load reduction, and it'd be a total of 86% total phosphorus reduction from those land cover types. The restoration strategies identified by the RAPS project team include nutrient management for fertilizer timing and amounts, as well as water level management and adding upstream practices to maintain a more consistent water level in Fawn Lake. Looking at Lower Mission Lake, the drainage area is largely made up of wetland and forest, with some developed area, grassland, and cropland area as well. There is a slightly larger upstream contributing area that is made up of a number of lakes, including immediately upstream of it, with being Upper Mission Lake. Looking at the source loads based on the HSPF model, you can see that wetlands are the largest contributing source, which makes sense again based on the overall area that is covered in wetlands in the Lower Missions drainage area. But then this is followed by cropland, developed land cover, and forest. Looking at the total maximum daily load allocation table, we can see that the load coming in from the upstream Upper Mission Lake is 166 pounds a year. The lake shed is contributing 743 pounds a year. Internal loading is contributing 959 pounds, while septic's 33 pounds and the atmospheric deposition 175 pounds. To achieve the water quality standards, there needs to be a reduction from the upstream Upper Mission Lake and the drainage area of 33%. The lake shed is reduced 40%, and internal loading 76% reduction. And overall, you see a 53% reduction in the total phosphorus load for Lower Mission to achieve the water quality standards. Looking at the load allocations for the various land cover types. You can see that the load reductions are achievable, although it will require aggressive implementation of BMPs in both the tributary area upstream of Lower Mission as well as the Lower Mission Lakeshed area, with 87% reduction in total TP loads coming from developed pasture and cropland land cover types in that tributary drainage area, as well as 88% reduction in total phosphorus loads coming from the developed pasture cropland land cover types in the immediate lakeshed area. Restoration strategies identified in the RAPS process by the project team include septic system improvements and lakeshore shoreline stabilization. If you have any questions for some local officials in your area, here are contacts for the various counties and SWCDs. In addition, the MPCA will be providing contact information for them. I want to say thank you for joining us. This is a bit weird, recording this, and hopefully information is easy to follow. You're able to gather useful information from this presentation. If you do have any questions as it relates to anything in this presentation, feel free to reach out to any of the project partners, MPCA or myself included, and hopefully everybody is staying safe during these crazy times, and we will get back to some semblance of normalcy in the near future. Thank you for taking the time, and I hope again that this was helpful.